Hello and welcome back to Noble Green and the second part of our look at Australia. Today we're going to be looking at Western Australia, Victoria and New South Wales. Now, starting off on the extreme west of the country, we've got the wine region of Margaret River, which is the most famous one. There's lots of other up and coming regions, but Margaret River is the one name that stands head and shoulders above the others. The predominant grape variety here is Cabernet Sauvignon. They also make some really good Bordeaux blends from Cabernet and Merlot, and some excellent Chardonnays, which we'll be looking at in a moment. Margaret River is on a stub of land that sticks out to the side of Australia, and its generally warm climate is tempered by currents coming up from the Antarctic Ocean via the Indian Ocean, which is the ocean to the west of Australia. And most of the land around here is quite low-lying, so you've got these lovely sort of river valleys that are perfect aspect for ripening the grapes with the setting sun. One of the wines we're looking at today is the Xanadu Chardonnay, which is a lovely example from a really good producer. Xanadu Chardonnay is matured in 25% new French oak, which isn't a huge amount compared to some really oaky Chardonnays that you might be more familiar with from Australia, but it just gives it a lovely, light, toasty character, a little bit of oak influence, but it's more about the purity of the fruit here. This is a really good example of Chardonnay, so let's give that a go first of all. This is lovely and bright and clear. Sometimes with some heavily oaked Chardonnays you get that yellow character to it from looking at it through the glass, but a lovely light wine, lovely freshness on the nose. You've got that oak coming through, it's lovely light toastiness, lovely sort of lemon citrus fruit, a little bit of floral minerality as well. Really good acidity, really light and fresh. Again, that toasty oak coming through, it's quite light, just a little bit of vanilla coming through. There's none of that more exotic spiciness you might get from French oak. Just a really nicely balanced wine. Really good with food. This would be perfect with prawns or chicken on the barbecue. Really nice. Now, as everyone knows, Australia is big, but people often don't realise how big. We're jumping right the way halfway across the country, 3,500 miles, to Melbourne, the heart of the Victoria wine region. Now, in South Australia that we looked at last episode, that is predominantly about big scale production. There's a few boutique productions, but it's mostly big conglomerates. In Victoria, it's much more about boutique wineries, small scale production, and to a large extent wine tourism. Most of the wine regions are in easy reach of Melbourne, and are very good with, there's loads of really beautiful restaurants there. Some of the best restaurants in Australia are found in that area. To the north of Melbourne, you have some of the higher altitude areas like the Grampians, Macedon Ranges, Heathcote, Glenrowan, and all these areas that are a little more hilly. Much further north than that, you've got the sort of bulk irrigated area of Murray-Darling. There's some good wines produced here, some Botrytis Semillons and so on, but for the most part it's bulk wine. The main problem they're having there is Australia's having a bit of a tough time of it over the last 2 decades. They're generally prone to drought anyway, particularly these inland irrigated areas, but they've had a double whammy. They've had both the El Nino, which can cause drought and other problems, and they also have La Nina, which brings in wet weather in other years, so it's kind of a feast or famine. Drought is obviously no good for vines because they need some water, and wet weather is just as bad because you lose most of your fruit to rot and mildew, and the grapes can burst if they get too much water in one go. Immediately outside Melbourne is the Yarrow Valley, and at the time of recording that was actually in the news this very morning as having bushfires, which just shows how bad they can have it over there. They've lost some of their vineyards, they've lost some of the actual vines. They've suffered, even if the vines survive, they can suffer from smoke damage, which is obviously bad for the fruit. Now, Yarrow Valley is quite big, and it has no sort of consistently defined characteristics. It's loads of different altitudes, loads of different aspects, loads of different soil types. It's predominantly clay loam, which is a good subsoil for grapes because it retains water quite well, which is obviously very important in Australia. It's important everywhere, but particularly so in Australia, which is so prone to these sort of drought conditions. Initially, the Yarrow produced some really good Bordeaux blends from Cabernet. Remember me saying initially that in Australia, they produced fortified wines, and then they went after the sort of Bordeaux and Burgundy market in Europe to sort of aim the styles that were coming out from there, to sort of break into the UK market in particular with wines that we would be familiar with back in the 60s and 70s. From the 80s and 90s onwards, the Yarrows predominantly started planting cooler climate varieties like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and they make some excellent Pinot Noir, which we'll be coming on to in a minute. So the Yarrow Valley's calling card really is Pinot Noir, and we'll be tasting that wine next. It's the Innocent Bystander Pinot Noir, which we'll have a little taste of now. If you'd like to charge your glasses. Lovely light colour, for a red wine, not something you'd expect from Australia. Even a Pinot Noir, it's actually quite light in colour from Australia. Some of them, they get a little more extraction. Lovely morello cherry and strawberry, a little bit of raspberry on the nose. Not too expressive, this is quite refined. It doesn't jump out of the glass like some can. So it's got that lovely, typical Pinot Noir character. A little bit of dryness, there's a little bit of tannin there. It's quite a nice ripe style, but it's still got a little bit of drying tannin, which means it'd be really good with some foods. Roast duck, partridge, any kind of game dish, winter game dish in the UK would be perfect with this. It's got that really nice balance of fruit, acidity and tannins. It makes it a really food-friendly wine. You could drink it on its own, but this really is a food wine for me. Heading to the south of Melbourne, there's a little spit of land called the Mornington Peninsula that historically produced more fruit than wine, and again was more planted with Bordeaux varieties, but now, again, Pinot Noir reigns supreme. This is actually where the International Pinot Convention is held biannually. It's an absolute mecca for Pinot lovers across the world, so it's no surprise that they have price tags to match. Some notable producers from the area are 10 Minutes by Tractor and Stonier. We're also starting to see some more international grape varieties rather than the traditional French varieties that are planted across most of the New World, not just Australia. Tempranillo, Pinot Gris, that does really well here. Some really nice off-dry Pinot Gris, really food-friendly, really good with the local fusion cuisine. It's also worth mentioning, with a little bit of tannin that's in this wine that we just tasted from the Yarrow and some from Mornington Peninsula, that there's a little bit more tannin than you'd expect from a Pinot Noir. Now, I think personally that's because allegedly some of the grapevines were brought over by James Busby, the famous viticulturalist and plant collector in the 19th century. He studied in France and he brought loads of cuttings from France over to Australia, as I believe I mentioned last time, to a certain extent. And the Pinot Noir cuttings he brought were from Clos Vougeot, and I think that these tend to have more tannins in them. There's the Pommard clones that we have these days that are actually identified that have more tannins in them than some other clones of Pinot Noir, which is why you get that, I think, you get that little bit more firmness. There's no real historical records for it, it's just my personal opinion, but that I think is why Yarrow and particularly Mornington Peninsula Pinot have this specific character to them. It's also worth mentioning in relation to the increase in varieties recently in Australia that, unlike in James Busby's day, Australia has a particularly strict plant quarantine these days, and with good reason. They need that biosecurity because they have quite a fragile ecosystem, a bit like New Zealand that we're coming on to next session, that they need to protect. But also they have large distances between the different vineyard areas, and for this reason the plus side is that you have large areas that are still phylloxera-free, which is great. So you've got some of those lovely old bush vines on their own roots that we mentioned last time. But also it means that new vines can be planted on their own new roots. In some instances there's experimentation with that. The exact difference between vines planted on their own roots and those on grafted roots is arguable, but that is the traditional way that it was done for hundreds of years. So a lot of vineyard owners are experimenting with planting vines on their own roots in the soil to see if that makes a difference to the fruit quality. Before we return to Victoria to taste the last wine that we're trying today, it's worth taking a little detour up the east of Australia, and we're going up into New South Wales. There's some really good wine quality areas such as Tumbarumba, Canberra District and Mudgee, to name but a few, that are producing some really good wines. But the one I want to focus on is the Hunter Valley, which is quite famous. Perhaps undeservedly so. I think it's more famous because of its proximity to Sydney, and again, the wine tourism associated with that than any other reason. It's not really a particularly good vine growing area. It's almost subtropical. It gets quite a lot of dampness, but the vines that are planted there have done quite well, and with good viticultural management and farming practices, they can produce some really good wines. One that's worth mentioning that is unique to the area is Hunter Valley Semillon, and there's one producer in particular, Tyrrell's, who sort of pioneered that style. Because of the danger of rot in the damp climate, they started picking quite early at about 11% potential alcohol, and what that gives you is screechingly, tooth-itchingly high acidity, and also quite a lean wine. Yes, battery acid is the most common tasting note. This really, really high acidity is almost undrinkable, but what it does do, after a few years in bottle, you start to get this lovely toasty complexity, sort of honeyed sweetness coming through from a really, really dry wine, and it can age for decades, really beautiful, almost like a Burgundy. It takes on really complex, beautiful notes as it ages. And again, given that the high acidity is still there, it never really goes away. But with this honeyed sweetness, you get that lovely balance that makes it a really classic food wine. Really good with fish, sushi in particular, just an absolute world-class wine that's well worth looking out for. Also, it's worth mentioning in the Hunter, they do make some world-class Shiraz as well, cool climate Shiraz, more northern Rhone in style, a bit more like Syrah. And given the high acidity that still remains in it, it can age more like a Burgundian Pinot Noir. It takes on those slightly leathery tobacco notes as it ages because it's, again, retains that high acidity without having too much fruit character, so you get that lovely balance as it ages. Looping back down via the sea, directly south of Melbourne, there's a large island called Tasmania, which many people have heard of, but not too sure what's produced there. Now, they make some really good Pinot Noir there, again, given the cool climate. But given that its average daily temperature is about the same as the south of England, unsurprisingly, they make some world-class sparkling wine here as well, mostly in the traditional method, from Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Pinot Meunier. A lot of the big producers have plantings down here. Some of the fruit does go into South Australian Pinot Noir and Chardonnay because it, again, retains that essential acidity that's really good in the blend if you're making a sort of multi-region blend. Again, there's nothing wrong with having a multi-region blend from South Australia. Some of the cheapest wines are labelled wines of Southeast Australia, but don't forget so's Penfolds Grange, which is one of the most expensive wines in the world, which is a multi-region blend. They just source the best fruit they can to make the wine of that particular vintage. Also from Tasmania, you're seeing some really good Rieslings, as you'd expect from the cool climate, some still Chardonnays. They tend not to use too much oak in them. And some of the best fruit comes from the Tamar Valley, Pipers River and Derwent Valley. That's some of the best regions to look out for if you're looking for Tasmanian wines. Now, heading back to Victoria, again, we're returning there to the heartland of the boutique wine regions, and we're heading to Rutherglen, which is one of the oldest sort of planted regions outside the Barossa. And there's a grape here called Durif, which is really unusual. It's a little bit obscure. It was originally a crossing from France of Syrah and Pèleroussin, which is a grape you don't see anymore. In fact, you don't really see Durif in France anymore. It never really made quality wine, but in the climate of Australia, particularly in the Rutherglen area, it makes a really lovely, inky, dark, rich wine. It just seems to have really found a home here. It's one of those happy coincidences of the right grape in the right place that makes this really lovely wine. So let's try that next. As you can see from the colour, if you want to sort of hold it next to the Pinot Noir, you can immediately see it's a very different beast. It's much, much darker. If you hold it against your hand or a piece of white paper, you can see that you can't see through it in the middle, which is a sign that it's got lots of colour matter in there, lots of pigments, lots of tannins. It's often mistakenly referred to as Petit Syrah, and there's a lot of similarities. It's got that lovely, plummy, dark, rich smell to it. Bags of fruit in there, a little bit jammy, but not overly so. Now the tannins are quite drying in the mouth. There's lots of fruit there, but there's loads of tannins as well. This really is a red meat wine. This is either a steak or kangaroo steak on the barbecue wine. It is really grippy. But bags of fruit, I would actually say in the summer, chill it slightly so you don't get too much of that overt fruit character. It's something they certainly do in Australia. They're quite used to chilling, even their heavy reds. I often say to people in the summer, don't think of it as chilling your white wine, think of it as taking the heat out of it, just so it's cool to the mouth when you drink it, because it takes that sometimes jammy edge that you get from these really ripe wines away from it. So it's a little bit more refreshing and a little bit more in balance when you're drinking it on its own or with food. The other speciality that's worth mentioning, as we're in the Rutherglen area, that is unique to Australia, is the Liqueur Muscats, which are from Rutherglen and neighbouring Glenrowan. Now these are wines that are made from Muscat and Muscadel, and they're a weird hybrid of the sort of sherry production and Madeira production. Now the wines are vinified in the normal way from slightly raisined grapes, so you've already got that rich sweetness in there. And then they're fortified with the addition of grape spirit in a similar way to port or sherry production to raise the alcohol level. And they're then aged in barrels for many years. They're also in sheds with tin roofs, so the barrels get quite hot, similar to the Madeira system, the Stufagem system, which is where the wines are heated and what is literally called Madeirized from the name Madeira, which means that the wines are deliberately heated and oxidized. But the sugar in there acts as a preserving agent as well, so you get that lovely caramelization. The other thing they do is they fractionally blend it more in the style of a sherry Solera system, so the young wines are consistently blended into the older barrels, but then the wine is drawn off, and so on, so that you get this constant, what in Spain is called the Solera system. so that old wine's constantly refreshed with the young wine. See, at the end of it, what you bottle is in a consistent style. Thank you for joining us for that whistle-stop tour of Australia, and next time we will be looking at New Zealand to the southeast.